Constance, over to you.
All right, thank you. Actually, I'm excited about next week because this talk today does talk about the tension between scholarship and collecting. I'm a little bit of both, so that's an interesting area for me to think about. But today, I call the mathematical collections and translations a failure that would not die because it keeps resurfacing and vanishing periodically since it was published in 1661, 1665, two different publication dates. Today, I'm going to introduce you to a series of books that show how historians and others have re-envisioned and really reinvigorated the book according to their own purposes and designs. So we start in the 17th century with the initial publication of the mathematical collections and translations. This was a book meant for study and practice. It gathers together Galileo's cornerstone writings and a lot of other writings around them from ancient times to the contemporary time to help people understand what was called the physico-mathematical experimental knowledge. And interestingly enough, that's part of the name of the Royal Society of London. So this is preceding the Royal Society of London in its making, although not in its publication. That's the collections part. The translation part reflects the fact that vernacular translation was well established by then. And it was this particular book was to help people who wanted to explore that physico-mathematical experimental knowledge, but whose Latin wasn't quite up to the task. So that's the collections. The book was meant to be delivered in 4 parts, 2 parts in each volume. So the first part would be Galileo's Dialogio, which established that the Earth does not stand still in the center of the universe. The second part would be of the first full-length ever biography of Galileo. The third part would be Two New Sciences, which was Galileo's final work and really probably his most important work. And the fourth part would be various treatises ending with the author-translator named Salisbury. So Salisbury's own experiments in specific gravity. So you get this physico-mathematical experimental theme running through the whole book. However, to make a long story short, the translator fell so far behind in writing the biography that the subscribers to the book were impatient and they didn't want to wait for it. So the biography was taken and moved to the end, so it could come out when the second volume was published. And then what to put in its place, I don't know, how about something on water by one of Galileo's students. And so this piece is actually on the title page, counted as book 2, part 2, but that's the biography. This should say book 1, part 2. That creates a lot of confusion in cataloging, so if you ever look for this book and you think you found the treasure, you found the water. Yeah, lesson learned, huh? Okay, so the Bodleian copy itself has 3 of these volumes bound into one, which is unusual. That wasn't the original plan, but there's a good reason for it. The biography was never actually completed. Either the author died before he could finish it, we think maybe in the Great Plague, or it was completed and it was at the printer being printed posthumously just in time to burn up in the Great Fire of London. So a very unlucky book. Let's see. After the Great Fire, John Collins, who was a person who worked in books, mathematical book printing, gathered up the remnants of whatever remained of this 4th volume and put it together with the first 3 and sent it to William Brereton, 3rd Baron of Brereton. And somehow, we don't know exactly how, but from his library, it made its way into the Earls of Macclesfield Library. And that's where it sat for many, many years. Now, most existing copies as I mentioned, most existing copies include only these first 2. The Bodleian version is rare. We know of like 8 to 10 of them that exist, and lots and lots of them are in England. I'd say almost half of them are here in England. We have at least 2 and maybe 3 in Oxford. The Earl of Macclesfield copy is one of a kind because it includes that pile of miscellaneous papers that would make up the 4th book, if only. So after 1667, the book completely disappeared. It continued to be sold in just the first volume until the 1680s, but it's not mentioned in contemporary literature. news books or even in correspondence, when people wrote into newspapers to say, I don't know about this whole thing about the earth and the sun, they were referred to the Latin edition, even though the English edition existed. Finally, in the 1830s, two historians were granted access to the mathematical collections, which was then in the Maxfield Library. One was John Eliot Drinkwater Bethune. We don't have a copy of his book, but he used the Salisbury biography fragments in writing his own biography of Galileo, even though he said the Salisbury edition was terrible. The other person's quite exciting. This is Stephen Peter Rigaud. He was a civilian professor of astronomy, the civilian professor of geometry, and he collected many works of correspondence from the Maxfield Library and published them in the works of the Correspondence of Scientific Men. He uncovered the correspondence that traces the movement of this cobbled together bit from the printer to William Brereton. As I said, we don't know how it got from Brereton to Maxfield, but at least we know how the first step was achieved thanks to Stephen Peter Rigaud. Now, we don't know when he visited the Maxfield Library how he might have used this copy of the biography, but we have some ideas of why he wanted to find that text. And that is because this copy actually, Francesca, will you turn to that page, actually belonged to Stephen Peter Rigaud. He's the one who gave it to the library, so you must have been very good to him. And he, throughout the book, there are corrections in pencil in the margins, and we assume those are his corrections that he made because he didn't have an errata sheet. The errata sheet is extremely rare. I know of two copies, one I just discovered about 2 months ago here in Oxford. And the other one, I guess maybe, could you turn to that page? Thank you. The other one is a mysterious photostat that appears here, and I'll try to explain where I think that came from later. But here we go. After the 1830s, the Earls of Maxfield librarians denied access to everybody. Anyone who asked was told that the books had been lost. They were not on the shelf where they appeared. There's a good legitimate reason for that. It could be true. I mean, it was a big library. It could be true. But it could also be that they wanted to preserve and protect the copy. And that's part of that tension that we talk about between collectors and scholars. After 1830, the book disappeared again, vanished from view until 1953, when, for reasons unknown, two copies appeared almost simultaneously. One, these are both translations of the Dialogio. The first was by Giorgio de Santillana, who was an Italian-born professor of history of science at MIT, and he published a revised edition of Salisbury's own translation. The reason for doing a revised edition as opposed to his own translation, even though he was a native Italian speaker, is that he felt that the 17th century idiom needed to be preserved. Otherwise it would be a disservice to Galileo. He also used it, interestingly, we all know that Galileo was subject to trial by the Inquisition, so he used his scholarly apparatus to condemn McCarthyism, or the second Red Scare, communist witch hunt, which was going on at that time. And he actually, in later works, did the same. Stillman Drake, this is his first translation of Galileo. It's his second book, from what I can find out. He was a banker at the time and financial consultant, and he says that he undertook the translation of Galileo in order to polish his Italian and to while away the hours while he was commuting to work. If you know Stillman Drake, he died in the 1990s, but he is still the world-renowned scholar on Galileo. And so to have his first book be connected to this one is like geeky excitement. All right. Those two books, we don't know why. They came out 320 years after Galileo's trial, and within 5 months of each other. So, yeah, we just have to figure that one out. Now, Drake was also a rare book collector already. And so in 1967, one of his favorite dealers decided to come out with a reprint, a facsimile reprint of the mathematical collections and translations. And this is a luxe copy. It's 200 copies only. not Italian, leather bound, large format, great paper. It's clearly a commodity. Drake wrote the introduction to it, and it's really valuable to scholars for two reasons. That introduction is basically the foundational work on the mathematical collections and translations. But it also makes available the first 3 tomes for people like me who don't have access to the actual work. So, for example, where I live, I can go 100 miles and find that. But if I wanted one of these, I would have to go, I think maybe 1,000 miles. You know, I would have to leave the Western United States, and who goes to the big cities? Yeah, so Drake wrote before the days of Google and online databases, and so his work is really riddled with gaps and errors. And so my goal when I wrote my recent book chapter, which is coming out this autumn, plug, but it was really to just look at what I could find to fill in the gaps and then maybe correct the errors. And to take on Stillman Drake was like frightening, but you really have to realize what he was up against in not having the research tools that we have today. So that was 1967 that came out. Now we jump forward to 2005 when the Earls of Maxfield Library went up for auction. And at that point, the books were found. And you can read a little bit about it in that catalog. But the important thing is that Nick Wilding, who is an expert on Galileo and texts, and particularly spotting forgeries, he was invited to examine the copy, and he wrote a paper that now fills in everything he could tell us about the biography. So lots of quotations, lots of information, and he discovered there was some correspondence tucked in among all those papers. So now we know about that as well. So those are really the 2 foundational pieces of research on that. And I would just like to invite you, I want to end this by saying that Wilding is definitely on the side of scholars when it comes to the scholarly collectors divide. And he ends his paper with a quote from Salisbury on the evils of collectors who don't let scholars see their work. And I'll invite you to read that yourselves. So thank you. It was sometimes used for the printer, for when they were going to reprint a book. And so I sort of wonder whether this errata sheet was created after the Great Fire and they thought they might need to reprint the book. But at any rate, it's not included in several of the copies that do have these 3 tomes. So here's the thing. When Drake was doing his census, he called on an Oxford bibliographer, P.J. Wallace, to help him. And so P.J. Wallace did a lot of the legwork that needed to be done for this, and his notes are also laid into this book. But I like to think that Drake made this photostat and sent it to Wallace as a thank you for his help. I don't know, I have no reason to think that that's true, except that, of course, that's how scholars work, right? And Drake did have a copy of the errata sheet. So that's the story behind that errata sheet, and it is exceedingly rare. So yeah, that's the story behind that. Thanks for asking.
Thank you. Okay, everyone.